I was in the middle of the most important presentation of my career when the banging started. Not gentle knocking, not a polite doorbell ring, but aggressive, impatient pounding that echoed through my home office like thunder. My laptop screen showed 12 faces staring back at me from the video conference, including my boss and 3 potential clients worth millions to our company. The sound was so loud that everyone on the call could hear it through my microphone. "I apologize," I said, trying to maintain my composure while my heart raced. "Let me just quickly see who that is." But the knocking didn't stop. If anything, it got more insistent, more demanding. I could hear muffled shouting from outside, though I couldn't make out the words. My colleagues looked uncomfortable, and I watched helplessly as one of the clients checked his watch with obvious irritation. Through my front window, I caught a glimpse of a familiar figure. Erin Mitchell, the self-appointed Homeowners Association enforcer of Willowbrook Estates, stood on my porch with her arms crossed and her face twisted into that expression of righteous anger I had come to dread. She was holding what looked like official papers and kept glancing at her watch, as if I was already late for some appointment I had never made. The pounding resumed, more violent than before. My boss cleared his throat on the call, and I knew I was losing them. This presentation was supposed to secure our biggest contract of the year, something I had been working toward for months. But Karen's assault on my front door was making it impossible to concentrate, let alone appear professional. "I need to handle this emergency," I told the meeting participants. My voice strained despite my efforts to sound calm. "Can we possibly reschedule for later today?" The disappointment in their faces was crushing, but I had no choice. I ended the call and rushed to the front door, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and anxiety. When I opened the door, Karen immediately stepped forward, invading my personal space with the confidence of someone who believed they owned not just their own property, but everyone else's too. She was a woman in her late 50s with perfectly white gray hair and the kind of rigid posture that suggested she had never met a rule she didn't want to enforce. Her eyes were sharp and calculating, and she held herself like a general preparing for battle. "I need your house access code immediately," she announced without any greeting or explanation. Her voice carried the tone of someone who expected instant compliance, as if my privacy and security were luxuries I had forfeited the moment I moved into this neighborhood. She held up a clipboard with official-looking forms and tapped it impatiently with her pen. I stared at her in complete bewilderment. The request was so absurd, so invasive, that for a moment I couldn't process what she was asking. "My what?" I managed to say, still trying to understand why she thought she had any right to demand access to my home security system. "Your access code," she repeated, speaking slowly as if I were a child who needed simple concepts, explained. "The HOA requires immediate access to all residential security systems for compliance verification. You were supposed to provide this information weeks ago, according to our new safety protocol." She showed me her clipboard again, though she held it too far away for me to actually read any of the documents. The absurdity of the situation was overwhelming. I had been living in this house for 3 months, and no one had ever mentioned anything about surrendering my security codes to the Homeowners Association. The idea that I would give any neighbor, let alone Karen, the ability to enter my home whenever they pleased, was so outrageous that I almost laughed. "I'm not giving you my security code," I said firmly, though my voice betrayed how shaken I was by her aggressive approach. "I've never heard of any such requirement, and I certainly wasn't informed about any deadline. You have no right to demand access to my private property." Karen's expression hardened, and her eyes narrowed with a kind of cold fury I had only seen in movies. She stepped even closer, and I could smell her overwhelming perfume mixed with what seemed to be barely contained rage. "You are in direct violation of Homeowners Association regulations," she hissed, her voice low and threatening. "This is not a request. This is a requirement for all residents of Willowbrook Estates." I stood my ground, though every instinct told me to step back from her aggressive posture. "I need to see these regulations in writing," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "and I need proper notice and time to review any changes to HOA policies. You can't just show up at my door during my work hours and demand access to my home." That was apparently the wrong thing to say. Karen's face flushed red, and she took another step forward until she was practically standing in my doorway. "Your work hours are irrelevant to HOA compliance," she snapped. And you don't get to negotiate with regulations that have already been approved by the board. Your non-compliance has been noted and there will be consequences. She turned on her heel and marched down my walkway with the mechanical precision of someone who had perfected the art of dramatic exits. But she didn't leave my property entirely. Instead, she walked to her car, retrieved what looked like an official notice, and returned to tape it prominently to my front door. The sound of the tape being aggressively applied seemed to echo through the entire neighborhood. "This is your final warning," she called out loud enough for anyone within 3 houses to hear. Continued violations will result in immediate enforcement action. The HOA has both the authority and the obligation to protect this community from residents who refuse to follow established protocols. As she drove away, I stared at the paper now decorating my front door like some kind of legal scarlet letter. The heading read, "Notice of Violation and Pending Enforcement Action," in bold, intimidating letters. Below that was a list of infractions I had supposedly committed, including failure to provide security access information, non-compliance with safety protocols, and obstruction of HOA official duties. Reading through the document, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. According to this notice, I had been in violation of various HOA regulations for weeks, despite never receiving any previous warnings or even being informed that these regulations existed. The most shocking part was at the bottom. Failure to remedy these violations within 24 hours may result in temporary removal from the premises pending full compliance review. I had moved to Willowbrook Estate specifically because it seemed like a quiet, well-maintained community where I could focus on my work and enjoy some peace. The Homeowners Association had been described to me as a typical organization that maintained common areas and enforced basic standards to protect property values. No one had mentioned that it was run like a totalitarian regime by someone who apparently believed she had the authority to evict residents on a whim. The timing couldn't have been worse. I was in the middle of the biggest project of my career, working remotely on a software development contract that required absolute focus and professionalism. My home office was set up perfectly for the long hours and complex technical work the project demanded. The idea that I might be forced out of my own house, even temporarily, was not just inconvenient, but potentially devastating to my professional reputation. I had heard rumors about Karen from other neighbors, whispered complaints about her aggressive enforcement of increasingly arbitrary rules. She had supposedly fined people for having the wrong color mailbox, for parking their cars too far from the curb, and for keeping their garbage bins visible for more than 6 hours after pickup. But I had assumed these were exaggerations, the kind of neighborhood gossip that gets blown out of proportion with each retelling. Now I realized that if anything, the rumors had understated the problem. Karen didn't just enforce HOA rules. She seemed to create new ones whenever it suited her purposes. The security code demand was clearly something she had invented on the spot, probably as a way to assert her authority over the newest resident, who hadn't yet learned to fear her arbitrary power. As I stood in my doorway reading and rereading the violation notice, I felt a mixture of anger and disbelief that someone could have this much control over my life without any oversight or accountability. The document was filled with official-sounding language and references to HOA bylaws, but it provided no specific citations, no clear explanations of what I had done wrong, and no reasonable path to compliance. The 24-hour deadline was particularly infuriating, even if I wanted to address these supposed violations. I had no clear understanding of what actions would actually satisfy Karen's demands. The security code requirement was obviously unacceptable, but the other infractions were so vague that I couldn't determine what changes I was supposed to make to my property or behavior. I decided to call the number listed on the notice, hoping to speak to someone reasonable who could explain what was really required and perhaps negotiate a more sensible timeline. But the number went straight to an answering machine with Karen's crisp, authoritative voice, explaining that HOA enforcement issues were handled strictly through written correspondence and scheduled appointments. The message instructed me to submit any questions or concerns in writing to the HOA office, which would respond within 5 to 7 business days. Given that I had been given a 24-hour deadline to resolve violations I didn't understand, this response timeline seemed designed to ensure failure rather than facilitate compliance. That night I barely slept. Every sound outside my window made me wonder if Karen was conducting some kind of surveillance, documenting additional violations to add to her growing list. I found myself checking and rechecking my door locks, even though the irony wasn't lost on me, that the person demanding access to my security system was the same person I most wanted to keep out. The next morning brought a new level of surreal nightmare. When I tried to leave for a quick trip to the grocery store, my key wouldn't work in the front door lock. I stood there for several minutes, turning the key and jiggling the handle, convinced that something must be stuck or broken. But gradually, the horrible truth began to dawn on me. Karen had somehow changed my locks. I walked around my entire house trying every possible entry point, but the result was the same everywhere. Every lock had been replaced or rekeyed, and I was effectively locked out of my own property. My laptop was inside, along with all my work materials, my clothes, my food, and everything else I needed to function as a human being. As I stood in my backyard feeling helpless and violated, I heard the sound of car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the side gate, I could see Karen approaching with two men I didn't recognize. One was carrying what looked like official paperwork, while the other had the kind of no-nonsense expression I associated with security personnel or law enforcement. "The eviction has been processed," Karen announced as if she were delivering good news. Her voice carried the satisfaction of someone who had won a difficult victory. "Your temporary removal from the premises is now in effect pending resolution of your multiple HOA violations." I stared at her in complete shock. "You can't evict me from my own house," I said, though my voice sounded weak and uncertain even to my own ears. "This is my property. I have a mortgage, insurance, legal ownership. You have no authority to lock me out." Karen smiled with a kind of cold satisfaction that made my stomach turn. "The Homeowners Association has broad enforcement powers as outlined in the community covenant you signed when you purchased this property," she said, holding up a thick folder of documents. "Repeat violations and non-compliance with safety protocols constitute a breach of community standards that requires immediate intervention." One of the men with her stepped forward and handed me a business card along with a small pamphlet. "Set Manor Motel," he said in a growly voice that suggested he had done this before. "The HOA has a partnership arrangement for temporary housing during compliance resolution. You'll be comfortable there while you work out your violations." The pamphlet showed a rundown motel that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. The rooms appeared small and dingy with outdated furniture and the kind of carpeting that had probably seen decades of questionable stains. The idea that I was supposed to live there while Karen held my house hostage was so absurd that I almost couldn't process it. "This is insane," I said, looking back and forth between Karen and her associates. "You can't just lock someone out of their own home because they won't give you their security code. This has to be illegal. I'm calling the police." Karen's smile widened, and she exchanged a meaningful look with the men beside her. "The police have already been informed of the situation," she said smoothly. "Officer Martinez is aware of the HOA enforcement action and the temporary housing arrangement. Everything has been handled through proper channels." I pulled out my phone to call 911, but Karen held up her hand in a gesture that was somehow both dismissive and threatening. "I wouldn't recommend making false reports about legal HOA enforcement actions." She said that could constitute harassment of association officials, which carries additional penalties under our community guidelines. The whole situation felt like being trapped in some kind of legal nightmare where normal rules didn't apply. And the person who had appointed themselves as judge, jury, and executioner was someone I had never voted for and couldn't hold accountable. Karen had effectively stolen my house and was now trying to convince me that I should be grateful for the privilege of paying to live in a city motel, while she decided whether I was worthy of returning to my own property. But I didn't have many options. My work materials were locked inside the house, and I needed access to my computer and files to salvage my career. The client presentation I had missed yesterday was supposed to be rescheduled for later in the week, and I couldn't afford to miss it again. If Karen was willing to let me back into my house after some period of compliance, maybe the best strategy was to play along until I could figure out how to fight back properly. The motel was every bit as depressing as the pamphlet had suggested. My room smelled like stale cigarettes and industrial cleaning products, and the furniture looked like it had been purchased during the Carter administration. The bed made ominous creaking sounds whenever I moved, and the air conditioning unit seemed to be locked in a perpetual battle between too hot and too cold, with no comfortable middle ground. But the real shock came 3 days later when I received an itemized bill for my stay. Not only was the HOA not covering the cost of my temporary housing, but I was being charged premium rates for what was clearly budget accommodation. The bill included charges for emergency housing placement, expedited service fees, and HOA administrative costs that nearly doubled the base room rate. When I called the number on the bill to dispute the charges, I reached an answering service that transferred me to Karen's office. Her secretary, who sounded like she had been coached on exactly how to handle these calls, explained that all temporary housing costs were the responsibility of the displaced resident, and that payment was required within 10 days to avoid additional penalties. I hung up the phone, feeling like I had fallen into some kind of parallel universe where property rights didn't exist, and neighborhood associations could operate like criminal enterprises without any oversight or accountability. But as I sat in that depressing motel room, surrounded by the smell of other people's desperation, I decided that I wasn't going to be another victim of Karen's power trip. I started by going to the public library to research HOA laws and regulations. What I found was enlightening and infuriating in equal measure. While homeowners associations did have significant powers to enforce community standards, they were supposed to operate within strict legal guidelines that included proper notice, due process, and reasonable enforcement procedures. Everything Karen had done to me appeared to violate multiple laws and regulations. The security code demand had no legal basis. The violation notice failed to meet basic due process requirements, and the lockout and eviction were almost certainly illegal regardless of what my community covenant said. No HOA had the authority to simply change someone's locks and force them out of their own home without going through proper legal channels. But the research also revealed something more disturbing. I wasn't the first person this had happened to in Willowbrook Estates. As I dug deeper into public records and online forums, I found a pattern of similar incidents going back almost 2 years. Karen had been systematically targeting residents with increasingly aggressive enforcement actions, and several people had been forced into temporary housing arrangements while fighting to regain access to their own properties. What made it worse was that most of these cases seemed to follow a similar pattern. Karen would create or enforce some obscure regulation, usually with impossible deadlines or unreasonable requirements. When residents failed to comply, she would escalate to lockouts and force temporary housing, and in every case I could find, the residents ended up paying substantial costs for their displacement. While Karen maintained that she was simply protecting community standards, I decided to reach out to some of the other victims, starting with phone numbers I found in old HOA meeting minutes and community newsletters. The stories I heard were remarkably consistent and increasingly disturbing. Karen had forced out a retired teacher for having an unauthorized bird feeder, locked out a young mother for parking her stroller too close to her front door, and displaced an elderly man for having window blinds that were allegedly the wrong shade of white. But the most revealing conversation was with Jennifer, a nurse who had been locked out of her house 6 months earlier for supposedly violating noise ordinances by working night shifts. Jennifer had spent 2 weeks at the same motel where I was staying, fighting to prove that her work schedule didn't actually violate any legitimate HOA regulations. The thing is, Jennifer told me during our phone conversation, I started noticing things that didn't add up. The motel charges were way higher than their advertised rates. And when I looked into it, I found out that Karen's brother-in-law owns the place. She's been funneling displaced residents to his business and taking a cut of the inflated charges. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. Karen wasn't just a power-hungry HOA enforcer. She was running a scam that involved fraudulently evicting residents and profiting from their displacement. The whole system was designed to generate revenue rather than actually enforce any legitimate community standards. Jennifer also mentioned that she had started documenting everything, including saving emails, taking photographs, and recording phone conversations where legally permitted. I've been building a case, she said, but I need more evidence and more victims willing to come forward. Karen's been careful to target people who don't know their rights or don't have the resources to fight back effectively. I realized that I might be exactly the person Jennifer needed. Unlike some of Karen's previous victims, I had the time, resources, and technical skills to conduct a thorough investigation. My background in software development meant I was comfortable with data analysis and digital research, and my recent displacement had given me both the motivation and the inside access to gather evidence that might not be available to outside investigators. Over the next several days, I threw myself into the investigation with the same intensity I usually reserve for complex coding projects. I created spreadsheets tracking Karen's enforcement actions, mapped out the financial relationships between the HOA and the motel, and started building a timeline of suspicious activities that went back almost 3 years. The patterns that emerged were damning. Karen had been systematically targeting residents who were new to the community, elderly, or otherwise vulnerable to intimidation. Her violation notices always included vague or impossible requirements, and her enforcement timeline was designed to make compliance nearly impossible. But most importantly, every single case that escalated to temporary housing involved the same motel, the same inflated charges, and the same lack of legitimate HOA authority. I also discovered that Karen had been falsifying HOA board meeting minutes to create the appearance of legitimate policy changes and enforcement authority. Many of the regulations she claimed to be enforcing had never actually been voted on by the community or approved through proper channels. She was essentially making up rules as she went along and then using fabricated documentation to make her actions appear legal and official. The breakthrough came when I managed to access the HOA email server through a forgotten password reset link that was still tied to my address. What I found there was a treasure trove of evidence that proved Karen's scheme went far beyond what any of us had imagined. Her correspondence with the motel owner included explicit discussions of kickback arrangements, strategies for maximizing the length of resident displacements, and plans to expand the operation to target more homeowners. But the most damaging evidence was a series of emails between Karen and someone identified only as M.R. Rodriguez, discussing the creation of fake violation reports and the coordination of lockout timelines to maximize motel occupancy during peak rate periods. It was clear that the entire operation was being run like a criminal enterprise with Karen as the mastermind and multiple accomplices helping to identify targets and execute the displacement scheme. Armed with this evidence, I reached out to an investigative journalist at the local newspaper who had previously covered HOA corruption in other communities. Sarah Chen was a reporter with a reputation for thorough research and fearless reporting on local government and community organization issues. When I explained what I had discovered, she immediately recognized the potential for a major story that could expose systemic fraud and protect other homeowners from similar schemes. Sarah's investigation moved quickly once she had access to the evidence I had gathered. She interviewed multiple victims, reviewed public records, consulted with legal experts, and traced the financial connections between Karen's HOA position and the various businesses that were profiting from the displacement scheme. Within a week, she had assembled a comprehensive expose that detailed not just the individual cases of abuse, but the broader pattern of corruption that had been operating in plain sight for years. The story broke on a Thursday morning with the headline, "Local HOA official accused of running eviction scam." Sarah's article detailed Karen's fraudulent enforcement actions, the financial kickbacks from forced temporary housing, and the systematic targeting of vulnerable residents who were unlikely to fight back effectively. The evidence was overwhelming, and the public reaction was immediate and intense. By that afternoon, my phone was ringing constantly with calls from other residents who had been intimidated by Karen, but were now ready to share their stories. The HOA office was reportedly flooded with complaints and demands for Karen's immediate removal from any position of authority. And most satisfyingly, several people mentioned seeing Karen frantically trying to remove copies of the newspaper from various locations around the neighborhood. But Karen wasn't ready to give up without a fight. The next morning, she showed up at my motel room with 2 men I didn't recognize, and a folder full of what she claimed were additional violation notices. Her demeanor was different now. Instead of the smug confidence she had displayed during our previous encounters, she seemed desperate and angry in a way that made me genuinely concerned for my safety. "You think you're very clever," she said, standing in my doorway with the same aggressive posture she had used at my house. "But you have no idea how much trouble you've created for yourself. The HOA has legal authority to pursue damages against residents who engage in harassment and defamation of association officials. I had been expecting this confrontation, and I was prepared for it. "I think you're the one who's in trouble, Karen," I said calmly. "Fraud, extortion, and theft of services are serious crimes. The evidence is overwhelming, and law enforcement is already involved." That was an exaggeration. I hadn't actually contacted the police yet because I wanted to make sure I had enough evidence to ensure they would take the complaint seriously. But Karen didn't know that, and her reaction told me that she was already worried about criminal charges. Her face went pale and she took a step backward. "You can't prove anything," she said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "The HOA operates under established legal authority, and all enforcement actions have been properly documented and approved." I pulled out my phone and showed her a screenshot of one of her emails discussing kickback arrangements with the motel owner. "This is from your official HOA email account," I said, "along with about 50 other messages that detail your entire operation. The reporter has copies of everything, and so do several lawyers who specialize in HOA fraud cases." Karen stared at the phone screen, and I watched her face cycle through several emotions. Shock, anger, fear, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. She was clearly trying to figure out how much evidence I actually had and whether there was any way to contain the damage she had created. "Those communications have been taken out of context," she said. "Finally, the HOA partnership with local businesses is designed to provide convenient services for residents during compliance resolution periods. There's nothing illegal about community organizations working with service providers." But even as she spoke, I could see that she didn't believe her own words. The evidence was too specific, too detailed, and too damaging to be explained away as legitimate business arrangements. Karen had been caught red-handed running a criminal enterprise, and she knew it. What happened next caught me completely off guard. Instead of continuing to argue or threaten me, Karen suddenly switched tactics entirely. Her voice became pleading, almost desperate, as she tried a completely different approach. "Look," she said, glancing nervously at the men who had accompanied her. "Maybe we can work something out. The community needs strong leadership, and sometimes that requires making difficult decisions that people don't understand. But I'm willing to consider resolving your situation if you're willing to be reasonable about how this information gets used." I realized she was trying to bribe me, offering to end my displacement in exchange for my silence about her criminal activities. The audacity was breathtaking, but it also confirmed that she knew exactly how serious her legal exposure was. Someone who believed they were operating within the law wouldn't be trying to negotiate hush money with their victims. "It's too late for that," I told her. "The story's already published. The evidence is already in the hands of authorities, and other victims are already coming forward. Your only option now is to cooperate with the investigation and hope that makes a difference when it comes to sentencing." Karen's expression hardened again, and for a moment I thought she might try to physically intimidate me. But instead she turned and walked away without another word, leaving me standing in my motel room doorway, feeling like I had just survived a confrontation with a dangerous criminal. That evening I received a call from a detective with the County Fraud Investigation Unit. Detective Williams explained that they had received multiple complaints about Karen's activities and were opening a formal criminal investigation. He asked me to come in the next day to provide a detailed statement and turn over any evidence I had collected. The police interview was thorough and professional. Detective Williams was clearly experienced with financial fraud cases, and he immediately recognized the significance of the evidence I had gathered. He explained that HOA fraud was an increasingly common problem, but it was rare to have such comprehensive documentation of the criminal activity. "Most of these cases rely on victim testimony and financial records," he told me. "But you've provided us with direct evidence of conspiracy, wire fraud, and extortion. The email communications alone are enough to support serious felony charges." He also mentioned that they had already executed a search warrant on Karen's home and HOA office, seizing computers, financial records, and other evidence that would help them build a comprehensive case. Several other law enforcement agencies were involved, including the State Attorney General's office, which had been investigating HOA corruption across multiple communities. 2 days later, I received the call I had been waiting for. Detective Williams informed me that Karen had been arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. The charges carried potential prison sentences of several years, and the financial penalties could include restitution to all her victims plus substantial fines. But the most satisfying news was that a judge had issued an emergency order requiring Karen to immediately return access to all properties she had illegally locked residents out of. I could finally go home. Walking back into my house felt like stepping into a different world. Everything was exactly as I had left it. But the relief of being back in my own space was overwhelming. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and for the first time in weeks felt like I could actually focus on my work. The next few days brought a steady stream of good news. The HOA board held an emergency meeting and voted unanimously to remove Karen from all positions of authority. They also voted to dissolve the existing HOA structure and form a new organization with transparent governance and proper oversight mechanisms. Several of Karen's victims filed civil lawsuits seeking damages for the financial and emotional harm they had suffered. A class action lawsuit was also being organized to address the broader pattern of abuse and to ensure that all affected residents received appropriate compensation. The motel owner was arrested as a co-conspirator in the fraud scheme, and his business was shut down pending a full investigation of its financial practices. The building was revealed to be in violation of numerous health and safety codes, and several former guests came forward with stories of overcharging and substandard conditions. But the most satisfying moment came 2 weeks later during what was supposed to be a routine HOA board meeting to discuss the transition to new leadership. Karen showed up, apparently believing she could somehow salvage her position or at least influence the process of selecting her replacement. I was there as an observer along with several other residents who wanted to witness the end of Karen's reign of terror. She walked into the community center conference room with the same arrogant posture she had always displayed, as if she still had the authority to intimidate and control everyone around her. The new interim board president, Mrs. Thompson, was a retired teacher with decades of experience dealing with difficult people. She looked up from her notes as Karen entered and said simply, "Mrs. Mitchell, you are not authorized to attend this meeting. Please leave immediately." Karen's face flushed red, and she started to launch into one of her familiar tirades about HOA authority and community standards. But before she could get more than a few words out, Detective Williams appeared in the doorway with 2 uniformed officers. "Karen Mitchell," he said in an official tone that carried across the entire room, "you are under arrest for violation of your bail conditions. You were specifically ordered to have no contact with HOA business or any of the residents involved in this case." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Karen looked around the room with an expression of shock and disbelief. The woman who had spent years terrorizing her neighbors with threats of legal action was finally facing real legal consequences for her actions. The irony was perfect. She was being arrested at the very meeting where the community was supposed to discuss how to prevent future abuse of HOA authority. The officers led her out of the room while she protested her innocence and demanded to speak to her lawyer. But her voice faded as she was escorted to the police car, and the room fell silent except for the sound of papers rustling as Mrs. Thompson returned to her agenda. "Well," Mrs. Thompson said, with the kind of calm authority that comes from years of classroom management, "I think we can all agree that our first priority is establishing clear policies to ensure this kind of abuse never happens again in our community." The meeting that followed was everything an HOA meeting should be: respectful, democratic, and focused on actually serving the interests of the residents rather than feeding someone's power fantasies. We discussed transparent budgeting, reasonable enforcement procedures, and proper oversight mechanisms that would prevent any single person from accumulating the kind of unchecked authority Karen had abused. As I walked home from that meeting, I realized that Karen's arrest represented more than just the end of her personal reign of terror. It was proof that even the most seemingly untouchable bullies can be held accountable when people are willing to stand up, gather evidence, and demand justice. I set my new security code that night, FREEDOM. It seemed like the perfect symbol of what we had all fought to achieve. And as I settled back into my home office to finally finish the work project that had been interrupted by Karen's initial assault on my door, I couldn't help but smile at the thought that somewhere across town, the Sunset Manor Motel stood empty and dark, a fitting monument to the downfall of the woman who had tried to turn our neighborhood into her personal kingdom.